The facade of suburban tranquility often conceals the deepest shadows. In the quiet Belgian city of Nivelles, a domestic partnership that began with the promise of shared futures would end in unimaginable horror. This is the story of Alison Cambier and Thierry Jaradin, a relationship that fractured under the weight of obsession, resentment, and a chilling connection to modern horror mythology. It is a case where the line between cinematic fantasy and brutal reality blurred irrevocably. The details surrounding the fate of Alison Cambier remain starkly illuminated by the evidence presented during the subsequent investigation and trial. The narrative centers on jealousy, financial strain, and an increasingly volatile environment fueled by a disturbing fixation. We will examine the sequence of events that led to the tragic conclusion of Alison's life, the psychological landscape of the man convicted of her murder, and the lingering questions that surround this devastating crime. Alison Cambier, a young woman striving for stability, found a companion in Thierry Jaradin. Their relationship was, by many accounts, turbulent. Early on, the signs of friction were perhaps masked by the ordinary difficulties of building a life together. But beneath the surface, Jaradin harbored deep-seated insecurities and possessiveness that would soon manifest into something far more dangerous. Financial pressures often acted as a catalyst for conflict. Reports indicated Jaradin was struggling professionally, and this strain began to poison the atmosphere within their home. Alison, meanwhile, was navigating the pressures of motherhood and her own aspirations, often finding herself at odds with Jaradin's escalating demands and mistrust. Central to understanding the pathology of this case is Jaradin's pronounced obsession with the Scream film franchise. This fixation was not a mere hobby. Investigators would later uncover how deeply this specific narrative, one involving masked killers, elaborate staging, and psychological torment, seemed to embed itself in his worldview. The iconic Ghostface mask became more than a movie prop. It became a symbol of control. The relationship deteriorated into what friends and family later described as isolation and control exercised by Jaradin over Alison. He reportedly sought to dictate her friendships, her movements, and her choices. This environment of siege created the perfect precursor for the desperate, violent actions that would follow. Investigators began piecing together the timeline, examining communications and testimonies that painted a picture of a relationship on the brink. The seeds of paranoia sown by Jaradin were taking root, transforming domestic disputes into something sinister. The normalcy of their street in Nivelles offered no warning. The tragedy was not instantaneous. It was a slow culmination of escalating psychological tension layered with Jaradin's fixation on the violence portrayed in popular media. The stage was set, tragically, within the very home meant to be a sanctuary. The documentary now shifts focus to the specific evening that marked the final confrontation. The evening leading up to the crime was characterized by an argument that escalated rapidly beyond the boundaries of typical domestic discord. Friends and neighbors reported hearing raised voices, but in hindsight, these were the final, unheard cries for help. Evidence suggested that Jaradin meticulously planned elements of the subsequent events. This planning indicated a premeditated mindset, moving the event beyond a crime of passion into the realm of calculated malice. The use of specific items later recovered by authorities hinted at the role his cinematic obsession played in the orchestration. Alison Cambier, aware of the danger, may have attempted to leave or seek external assistance in the hours preceding the incident. The investigation focused heavily on establishing the final moments of communication, seeking any digital breadcrumb that might have detailed her fear or Jaradin's intent. The psychological state of Thierry Jaradin during this period is crucial. Experts analyzing the case would later suggest a profound dissociation from reality, where the lines between his obsession, the Scream narrative, and his immediate environment had dissolved. The mask, in this context, served as an instrument of dehumanization, both for the victim and potentially for the perpetrator himself. It is here, in the confines of their shared residence, that the confrontation reached its climax. The narrative shifts from psychological tension to physical violence. While explicit depictions are avoided, the subsequent police investigation confirmed a brutal and overwhelming assault that left Alison Cambier gravely injured. The atmosphere of the house during the commission of the crime was reportedly one of utter control exerted by Jaradin. The aftermath suggests a perpetrator who sought not just to eliminate his partner, but perhaps to stage or enact a perverse scenario he had mentally rehearsed through his cultural fixations. The discovery of the crime scene provided authorities with the gruesome reality of what had transpired. The investigation team faced a scene designed, perhaps subconsciously, to mimic the stylized horror of the very films Jaradin admired. This element, the staging, was a critical piece of evidence pointing toward the perpetrator's state of mind. Forensic examination was paramount. Evidence collected detailed the extent of the violence inflicted upon Alison. The methodical nature of the attack, contrasted with the chaotic emotional background of the relationship, presented investigators with a complex psychological profile to decipher. Crucially, Jaradin did not immediately flee. His actions immediately following the crime suggested a calculated attempt to manage the scene or perhaps a momentary paralysis after the extreme act was committed. It was during this window that law enforcement was alerted, often through the intervention of concerned relatives or neighbors responding to the sustained silence or disturbance. The role of the Ghostface iconography cannot be overstated in understanding the police response and the subsequent media coverage. The visual element injected a surreal, almost theatrical quality into what was fundamentally a brutal act of intimate partner violence. The media latched onto this connection, framing the narrative instantly. The physical evidence directly linking Thierry Jaradin to the scene and the assault was overwhelming. Witness statements regarding the increasing hostility, coupled with forensic findings, began to solidify the prosecution's case. This was not an accident, but a deliberate, fatal attack fueled by possessiveness and psychosis. The immediate aftermath saw the swift apprehension of Thierry Jaradin. The transition from the isolated horror of the residents to the cold reality of the judicial process marks the next pivotal stage in this tragic story. The community was left grappling with how such darkness could erupt from such an ordinary setting. The legal proceedings that followed were intense, focusing heavily on establishing the premeditation and Jaradin's mental capacity. The defense faced the unenviable task of navigating the highly publicized connection to the Scream franchise, which inherently suggested a level of planning that courts view seriously. Prosecutors argued that Jaradin leveraged his obsession as a shield, a way to externalize his control and justify violence. They presented evidence showcasing his deteriorating mental state leading up to the event, portraying him as an individual who deliberately chose violence over reconciliation. Expert testimony regarding Jaradin's psychological profile became central to the trial. Psychiatrists analyzed his fixation, debating whether it amounted to an insanity defense or merely a significant influence on a rational, albeit disturbed, actor. The consensus generally leaned toward recognizing his capacity to understand the wrongfulness of his actions. The focus during the trial was also heavily placed on Alison Cambier's final months. Her increasing fear, documented through text messages and personal journals introduced as evidence, served to humanize the victim and underscore the severity of the abuse she endured prior to the fatal night. The verdict, when it finally arrived, brought a sense of resolution to a case that had captivated and horrified the Belgian public. The conviction confirmed the prosecution's narrative that Thierry Jaradin was fully culpable for the murder of Alison Cambier. Sentencing reflected the gravity of the crime and the calculated nature of the act. While the legal system delivered its final judgment, the emotional toll on the families and the wider community remained profound. The court proceedings concluded, but the social discussion lingered. How much influence do violent narratives truly hold over vulnerable minds? Analyzing this case requires looking beyond the sensational headlines generated by the film connection. At its core, this is a devastating example of intimate partner violence, where underlying issues of control and jealousy reached a fatal apex. The Scream element served as a disturbing texture, not the root cause. Sociological analysis often examines the interplay between media consumption and antisocial behavior. In Jaradin's case, the films provided a framework, a recognizable script, for an already developing violent impulse. It offered a method for theatricalizing domestic tragedy. Alison Cambier's story is ultimately one of victimhood under the shadow of delusion. As the years pass, the details of the movie-inspired facade may fade, but the devastating reality of a life unjustly ended remains. The pursuit of justice offered closure, but the void left by the tragedy serves as a permanent echo in the community of novels. What remains is the necessity to look past the mask and address the real darkness beneath.